I don't mean to pick on any one individual because there are lots of self-help books of this kind, but I will pick on one because it just jumps out at me, right? So there's this guy you may have heard of called Jordan Peterson, right? Who has a book called 12 Rules for, what's it called? 12 Rules for Life or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that one always sticks in my mind, it's not so much the content of the rules or how, like the other stuff that he says, but the foreword, which he didn't write, of that book amazed me when I read it, because I've read it several times because I kind of couldn't believe it, right? The guy who's a psychoanalyst and a neuroscientist, I believe, who wrote the foreword, actually spends quite a lot of it valorizing rigid rule-following behavior, right? So it's a book about 12 rules. He begins by comparing them to the 10 Commandments, right? Doesn't go quite as far as to compare Jordan Peterson to Moses, but he kind of gets pretty close. So he says, we've got these 12 rules. They're a bit like the 10 Commandments. It's not the 20. He says at one point, he says it's not the 10 suggestions, or the 10 guidelines, it's the 10 Commandments. Like sometimes people need strict, clearly defined rules to follow, right? And the reason I thought that was weird is that he doesn't mention, and I guess it kind of sounds like he's not aware of. I can't believe that Jordan Peterson isn't, though. Like, there's a body of research literature that is quite influential in modern behaviour therapy, that deals with what we call the problem of rule-governed behaviour. And the problem with rule-governed behaviour is, to cut a long story short, a number of research studies, influential research studies, have shown that when people try to follow rules like this that seem kind of quite absolute, like commandments, it tends to lead to rigidity and a lack of coping flexibility, right? So it's kind of the opposite of what we want. So it's a hazard, well-known hazard in modern psychotherapy, that if you're too prescriptive and you just tell people, hey, just follow this strategy or something. Now, ironically, one of the 12 rules that Jordan Peterson gives is that you should tell the truth or at least never lie, which happens to be almost identical to one of the definitions of justice that Socrates disputes in this dialogue by Xenophon. So Socrates uses this as almost the same thing as an example of a maxim or a rule that's overly simplistic, right?
Yeah.
That was 2,400 years ago, right? But also in modern psychology, like in cognitive behavioural therapy, we have the same understanding that often, because when we assess clients in the first session, we ask them, what do you currently do to cope with your depression? What do you currently do to cope with your anxiety? And people have coping strategies that they've either come up with themselves, or they've got off the internet, or from self-help books that they've read. And often they're using them maladaptively. Otherwise, why would they be in the consulting room, right? And to be fair, this is more of a problem with people in psychotherapy than with the non-clinical population, so-called normal population. Although in my experience, they're not that normal sometimes. But people that don't have clinical depression or anxiety might not experience this as such an issue. We tend to become unfortunately, we become more rigid in our rule following the more we experience stress, or the more we experience strong emotions like anxiety, depression, or anger. Then the coping strategies that we apply more in a black and white, rigid, absolutistic kind of way, and then that just tends to lead to more and more problems. So the first thing we do is identify the coping strategies that people are using, and often we have to ask them to quit using them. Because the reason in therapy is because these strategies are backfiring. And it might be because people are applying them too rigidly and overextending them, or that they've somehow turned them into subtle forms of avoidance, or that they have disadvantages that they haven't really thought through. I'll give you an example. This is another one of Jordan Peterson's 12 rules, actually, that sometimes people have been told that if they stand up straight and they kind of put their shoulders back, and they have fake it to make it, and they have confident body language and look people in the eye. That's going to make them more confident, right? And give them social confidence, right? For instance, like that's quite common among certain clients, right? But what they might not realize is that many different self-help techniques, if someone is prone to social anxiety or social phobia, as it's called in the extreme form, social anxiety disorder, then one of the main maintaining factors for social anxiety is heightened self-focused attention. We know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? So the problem with self-help techniques in that context is that a great many self-help techniques actually increase self-focused attention. So if I try to control my breathing or relax my muscles or change my posture, it forces me to focus more attention on myself than normal. And that increases social anxiety in social situations. So changing your posture and stuff might actually work in situations where you're not that anxious, or it might work in situations where you're not like the center of attention or whatever. But if you have social anxiety and you feel that people are looking at you, and then you try and change your posture, you're probably going to like double or treble your self-focused attention and make your anxiety much worse, right? And many self-help techniques indirectly have that same backfire in a similar way. So in therapy, usually, again, it's just a question of sitting down with people and going, what do you think are the pros and cons of using this technique? Because in some ways, all self-help techniques have some advantages, but they also all have disadvantages as well. So what's usually missing is that in books you get overly kind of prescriptive, one-size-fits-all advice, and then people under duress will apply it even more rigidly, insensitive to changes in the environment, not really weighing up the consequences. And the more anxious they get, the more they'll hang on to this, clutching at straws of this technique. But what needs to happen is to think through the consequences of it. And also another way of doing the 2-column technique is to say, let's say there's a good way and a bad way of changing your posture, like for instance, or faking it to make it. Or there's a good form of mindfulness and a bad form of mindfulness. What would the difference be? Like, how would you identify healthy mindfulness and what might cross over into unhealthy mindfulness? How do you distinguish between the good and bad versions of this concept? And again, just teaching people to reflect on things and question them. Like, it might sound simple. Well, you do that. That happens in almost all cognitive therapy. It's something that's a little bit more intangible because it's an experience. It's a skill that comes from thinking things through. That often is completely missing from, especially if you get a self-help book and it says treat this like the 10 commandments, kind of thing. That's really doing the opposite and risks discouraging. Although, to be honest, I think Jordan Peterson himself later in his book does acknowledge that there are exceptions to some of these rules. But even the language of prescribing rules and things, and certainly comparing them to 10 commandments, and when I first read that, it struck me as being obviously at odds with what we normally do in psychotherapy and what the research literature shows about rule-governed behaviour and the problems associated with that. So I wanted to emphasise that because when I talk to people about self-help, this comes up over and over and over again. Like, the world is full of self-help junkies who wind up in psychotherapy. And they say, I don't understand it. I've read all these self-help books and I'm really, really trying hard to fake it till I make it. I'm really trying hard with my mindfulness and stuff like that. And I'm just getting worse. It kind of feels like it's helping, but I'm not really getting better. Right. You hear that a lot. And you think, well, you have to analyze what you're doing and evaluate it more critically, and figure out the pros and cons and how you would tweak it or adjust it to suit different situations. And maybe mindfulness, and maybe speaking your mind and maybe changing your posture isn't the best strategy in every situation, right? Maybe in some situations you want to do something different. That's coping flexibility, right? It's this coping flexibility, actually, and the ability to think on your feet a little bit more. And I hate to break it to you kids, you're going to have to think for yourselves, right? But the ability to think for yourselves is the main thing, actually, beyond any rules that anyone can give you. Like, there's one of the main things that's going to contribute to genuine emotional resilience across situations. What research on coping shows is that nobody typically develops emotional resilience by just depending on one strategy all the time. Like, genuinely resilient people use different techniques and different strategies in different situations. You know, they're more adaptive. You know, but that's a skill. It may be the very fact that we become overly dependent on lists of rules is one of the sources of our psychological problems. You know, we're too passive in that regard. That's in a way, the Socratic method is addressing that same problem.